Okay, chapter 13. Where my pen go? There it is. All right, so chapter 13. Mostly about inverses. Now, there's some tricks to this that I'm going to point out that's going to make this really actually a pretty easy chapter, or at least a good. If you understand a few things, you can at least make a really good guess on a lot of problems and tend to be right. Now, if you see some awkward pauses in the video, it's because I have to blow my nose because allergies are really killing me right now. So this is gonna be one of those moments. So hold on a second. All right, that was fun. Number one. So the function f of x has the inverse of 11 over 2x minus 1/4. Which of the following functions is f of x? So first off, whenever you see this notation, can I erase that? Yeah. This just means inverse x or inverse fx. Okay. So it's the -1 doesn't really mean anything here. It's just a way of indicating that this is the inverse function. Now, inverse function means opposite function. So how we calculate the inverse? Well, let me ask you a few things real quick. If I had the point 1,4 and I asked you what's the opposite of the point 1,4, I would hope you would say that it's 4,1. And if I ask you what's the opposite, if I have the point 2,8, what's the opposite of that? I would hope you say 8,2. If I had the point -1, 6, and I asked you what the opposite of it was, I would hope you would say 6, -1. Okay? So in all those points, what did we do? We switched x and y. And that's exactly what you're going to do on these functions. So when you have a function, and I'm going to write it as y equals, but it's the same thing over 11 over 2x minus 1/4. Here's an awkward pause. Hold on. Okay, I promise I took some Claritin, so we're gonna be just fine. All right. So when I try to solve this, what you're gonna have to do to start with, if you're gonna work this problem out by hand. Now I'm gonna tell you what the secret is after this problem, but let me do it the old-fashioned way first, and then I'll tell you what the secret is. But to start this problem, we are going to switch x and y. So we're going to make this x equal to 11 over 2y minus 1/4. Same function, but you literally switch x and y. And now to solve this function, you just have to try to get the y by itself like anything else. So to do that, to get the y by itself, I'm going to start by adding 1/4 so that I can move it over to the left side. So adding 1/4. So this will be x plus 1/4 equals to 11 over 2y. Now, don't look at this as a fraction. Look at this as two different numbers, 11 being multiplied to y and 2 being divided. So let's take care of those one at a time. Let's say I want to undo dividing by 2. Well, then I'll multiply by 2. So when I multiply both of these by 2, that left side will cancel out, or I'm sorry, the right side will cancel out. It'll just be 11y. And on this side, we'll have 2 times x, which makes 2x. And then 2 times 1/4, which would make 2/4, but 2/4 is the same as 1/2. So I'm just going to write this as 1/2. Okay. So let me erase this. Let me have a little more space. If you want to see this, you can always rewind. But we have right now 2x plus 1/2 equals 11y. So now we just got to get rid of the 11. So divide both sides by 11. Now when I do that, or I guess both of these, technically it's both of these, right? Both of these by 11, which makes that 2 over 11x. And then 1/2 divided by 11, just technically think of it as dividing by 2 and 11 at the same time. So if you're dividing by 2 and 11, then you're dividing by 22. So these technically get multiplied together. It's kind of weird, but that's how it happens when you have a dividing thing. So that's going to be 1 over 22, equal to our y. Which then gets us our answer of, what, d, maybe? Is it d? It's d? I think it's d, yeah. So here's the trick. Here's what I want to point out to you, okay? notice the inverse function, the original function, was 11 over 2x minus 1/4. And the new one was 2 over 11x plus 1/2. Now, the thing about inverse functions is they're opposite functions. So when it comes to a linear function, it's the slopes that are the key thing to be opposite. Notice that this slope was 11 over 2, and then the opposite function was 2 over 11. So that's going to be the case on all inverse functions as well. So let's say I have a line that is y equals 1/2 x plus 8 or something, right? I know without doing any math at all that the inverse function will be the opposite of 1/2 x. Imagine flipping this over. It would be 2 over 1, which is 2 over 1 or 2x. So my function, my inverse function, will have to have 2x in it. Okay? In another example, let's say I have a function y equals 1/4 x plus 3. Well, if this is my function, then the opposite of 1/4 x, the inverse function, will be 4x, because 1 over 4, the opposite of that would be 4 over 1, and 4 over 1 is 4. So just knowing those things can really help. And even other examples, like if I have an x squared function, right? Let's say I've got some sort of x squared function. The opposite of this, the inverse function, will be a square root function. Okay? So I'll be looking for a radical sign as an answer choice. And if it was an x to the third function, the opposite would be a cube root function, but it would still be that radical, right? Those things you really need to remember because they can really help you at least take a good guess. So look at number 2 where it says f of x equals 8 plus x over 4. So keep in mind that this would be the same as 2, and this would be the same as x over 4, which is also just 1 over 4, right, x. So knowing that, I'm looking at this primarily because that's my slope number, my 1/4 x. So because that is my slope number, I would know that its inverse would be the opposite of 1/4, right, which would be 4 over 1, which is 4x. So when I'm looking at g of x, and I see that g of x has that slope of 4, I'm thinking, okay, it's very possible that these are inverses, since the original function, which is technically shown up like this, but is the same thing as that, since this function has a slope of 1/4, the inverse has to have a slope of 4, and so I would guess, just based on just not even doing any math, I would guess that it's probably yes. Now, doesn't necessarily guarantee it, but it's a good possibility. So if you actually work it out, remember this is y equals 8 plus x over 4. If you actually work this out, remember you just do it by hand. You switch the x and the y. So you change that to x, you change this to y, keep everything else like normal. And then you could solve it. So you could start by multiplying 4 on both sides. So you can see the 4x is starting to come to life. You get the 4x equal to 8 plus y. And then you can deal with the 8, and then you can answer whether it's yes or no. And it looks like, I think, maybe yes. Okay. So number 3, again, look at the two functions. One of your functions has a slope of negative 1/4 x, right? That's the f of x function. The f of x has a slope of negative 1/4. Which means the inverse function would have a slope of negative 4. And I don't see that in g of x. Do you? Do you see g of x have that slope? I do not. So just primarily based on just that alone, there's nothing really to do here because that's what I'm expecting. The inverse is always going to be the opposite, and that's not the opposite. And when I say opposite, I don't mean change in sign. You're not going to change the sign here. The sign's going to stay the same. It's just the fraction would flip over. So that's important to make a note of. Okay. So do that for number 4. Look at the slope of number 4. You have 4 over 3x. Remember that the inverse would have the opposite slope. So just based off that alone, you don't have to do any work to try and answer that question. Now, if you're stuck, please just shoot me a remind or ask me in class, and I can help explain it to you. But I don't want to give you all the answers. That's why I'm not, I'm just going to at least give you that hint. Now look at number 5. Look at the slope of number 5. You would have 3x over 8. So that's a slope of 3/8. So remember, the inverse would be the opposite of that. So look on your answer choices to see which of those would have that opposite slope. Okay. And also in number 6, this is one I'll explain a little bit more of. But you see, at number 6, it has a cube root function, right? You have the cube root of negative x minus 1. I'll just leave it as y. I know it's h of x, but we'll just leave it as y for now. All right. So that's the regular function. Remember, we talked about this. What's the opposite of a cube root? The opposite of a cube root is a cube function. So know those things. If you know those things, you can really narrow it down. Because now, just based off knowing that alone, I know the inverse would have to be either a or b. The inverse function, if my original one is a cube root, the inverse function would have to be a cube function because those are opposites of one another. So it's either a or b. Now, based on what I see, I would guess maybe it's b, only because the minus 1 is the same as the minus 1 that's in the problem. Doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but it's what I would do. But yeah, you can work this out. Remember, if you actually work this out, you switch the x and the y, make negative y minus 1, and you work it out. So the opposite of a cube root here, to cancel this out, would be to cube both sides. So when you do that, you can, of course, see the cube part come to life, negative y minus 1, and you can just continue solving this. And I think it's either a or b. I'll let you guys figure out which one it is by solving the rest of it. Number 7, again, look, you have a cube function, right? Something to the third power. You have that x plus 1 to the third power. So your inverse function will be a cube root function, which again narrows your choices down. So now that you've narrowed it down, remember, if you actually want to solve it, you can at least on the test, if you forget how to solve it on the test, at least know that you've now made this problem a 50-50 problem. So that's the most important thing. If you can actually solve it, though, by all means go for it. But at least you've narrowed down the choices. Because the answer choice, being that this is a cube function, you should pick an answer choice that's a cube root function. Okay? But yeah, if you actually want to solve it, remember you switch x and y, and you solve it. So the first thing you would do is add 2 to both sides, right? And then I would let you finish it from there. I think it's just solving an equation. All right, number 8. Number 8 is a really terrible question, not going to lie, because it says find the inverse and then the graph. You could pick the inverse based off what we talked about with the slope before. So remember, f of x right now in number 8 has a slope of 1/4 x. So the inverse function will have a slope that is opposite of this, which we've already talked about. So I'm just not going to tell you again, but I'm assuming you're going to figure it out. And only one of the answer choices has that slope. The only problem I have with this question is the graphs are not correct. The graphs of those lines are just wrong. They're just straight up wrong, which makes no sense to me. But you can still pick the right answer if you at least understand the slope part of this, okay, that we've already talked about earlier in the video. So that's it for chapter 13. I'll see you guys in chapter 14. I know I was very vague in this chapter, but because it's actually so easy that I just didn't want to give you the answer away. And because of that, I know I might have made it more difficult, like doing that. But that's why I think it's really a better thing that we do in person than you watch in a video, that chapter. So if you're stuck, just feel free to hit me up or ask me in class. No big deal. Okay, I'll see you in chapter 14.